I'm Jim Collins. I teach early modern France here at Georgetown. Violence is a topic of great interest to me because going back to Stuart's statistics from the other day, the city where I grew up, Hartford, Connecticut, was the most violent city in the United States when I was growing up there. The murder rate was 50 per 100,000, so it gives you some idea of how violent a place it was. And I lived in a neighborhood where I was familiar with some of those incidents. Let's just leave it at that. Our speaker for this special session is Deborah Posel of the University of Cape Town, South Africa. And as you know from the program you have in front of her, she's a professor of sociology at the University of Cape Town. And she is the founding director of HUMA, which is an institute, an interdisciplinary institute at the University of Cape Town. And you can go online and read all kinds of interesting things about it. Yeah. All right, so I'll pass the word over to you for this afternoon's ending keynote speech.
Thank you very much. So let me start with a thanks and an apology. I want to echo other people's thanks to Aparna and the others who've organized the event. Thank you for bringing me here, and it's very nice to be part of these discussions. And an apology for the fact that you have to be here at this terribly late hour. And I will do my best to go through this as quickly as possible. Okay. There is increasing recognition of the centrality of violence in the making of modernity, or modernities, depending on your theoretical predilection. In contradistinction to the earlier emphasis a la Max Weber or the early Foucault on the legal rational dimensions thereof. The case has been made in general theoretical terms in the work of Agamben or the later Foucault, for example. But it's for us historians and social researchers to make historically embedded contextual sense of the varying insinuations of violence in the regulation, meaning, and experience of being modern. So what I want to do in this lecture is to take up one very particular case, and that is how violence has figured in the emerging post-apartheid order, what we like to call the new South Africa. Now, South Africa, you probably know, is one of the more violent places on the planet, and has been for a long time, as John Iliff and other historians of colonialism in Africa remind us. The demise of apartheid in 1994 carried the promise, carried the hope, in fact, of a more peaceable society with democracy as its instrument. Yet the transition from apartheid has seen, alas, the intensification of violence in many spheres of everyday life. And that ranges from criminal violence, sexual violence, what's become known as mob justice, amongst other forms of violence. At least this is how post-apartheid is lived. Robust measurements are sparse, particularly in respect of the more intimate forms of violence, where there are long-standing habits of underreporting. But I think it's uncontroversial to say that South Africa's democracy is a space of very unsettling orders of violence that are much spoken about, much fretted about across the society at large. Violent crime is a national preoccupation. At times, it becomes a national obsession. If the new South Africa is modern, as it emphatically claims to be, violence is by now absolutely central in the imaginary of that modernity and the ways in which it is lived. So in this lecture, in this talk, I want to focus on the place of sexual violence in this scenario, in this post-1994 scenario. And you probably know that South Africa has extraordinarily high rates of sexual violence. Again, measurements are perhaps a little bit dubious, but the one that's being touted at the moment, which you'll hear on the radio, on TV with regularity at the moment, is that there is a rape in South Africa every 4 minutes. That might be a rape of a woman, a child, or a very elderly person. And there have been no noticeable ebbs in the occurrence of sexual violence in recent years. But despite that, and despite the hyperbole of the problem, it doesn't sustain public interest or concern in any continuous way. The pattern is more one of episodes of public interest or concern associated with the temporarily heightened visibility of sexual atrocity. I want to talk about how this has produced instances of what the literary scholar Mark Seltzer calls a pathological public sphere, and the wound culture, as he terms it, associated with this. And I want to show how, or argue how this in turn does the work of dystopic nation building. Dystopic because the version of the nation that it invokes is quote unquote sick, but with the power to produce an imagined community under exactly that sign, nonetheless. Indeed, I want to suggest that in recent years, this is the most sustained version of the new South Africa. I'm going to focus mainly on eruptions of public anxiety about sexual violence in recent years, and in 2001 in particular, of which I've made a very detailed study. But there's a very immediate framing of the issue, which pulls South Africa and India into the same frame. So let me start there. And I'm referring, not in this instance to Oscar Pistorius, although we will talk about that case along the way. I'm referring to two recent gang rapes, one in India and one in South Africa. You'll remember, I'm sure, what happened in New Delhi on the 16th of December last year, when a 23-year-old woman was raped and mutilated and subsequently died of her injuries. And you'll remember that this had an electrifying effect on Indian public opinion. Also internationally, it garnered intense media coverage, including in South Africa. Initially known as India's daughter, the young woman, who was a graduate, and a male friend of hers boarded a bus. They were then beaten. She was gang raped by the driver, his assistant, and 4 male passengers. And she died on December the 29th of her injuries. It was only on the 5th of January that her father released her name. She was Jyoti Singh. When Aneen Boyson was gang raped in Bredasdorp, which is a small town in the Western Cape, on February the 2nd, this story also hit international and international headlines. Within the South African media, there were immediate cross-references to the Indian story. Indeed, the intense interest in what had happened to Jyoti Singh was probably one of the primary drivers of the media's coverage and public scrutiny of the Boyson case. After all, extremely violent rapes and gang rapes happen in South Africa on a regular basis. Only a tiny fraction surface in the public eye. Which ones do or don't will depend on a host of contextual factors, including the kind of media intertextuality that was evident in this instance. There were some striking similarities in both cases. Both women were young, both were gang raped, both were disemboweled, both died as a result of their injuries. In South Africa, Aneen's rape, mutilation, and murder provoked more of a national public outcry than has been the case for a while now. Various public arenas resounded with declamations that enough is enough. There were loud calls for action, intervention, drawing attention to how keenly Indian society had been mobilized in opposition to such brutality, and urging likewise to rouse the South African public from its apparently inured numbness in the face of unrelenting sexual violence. The president, Jacob Zuma, weighed in too. He expressed, and I quote, "the whole nation's outrage at this extreme violation." Media coverage of the case exhibited a pattern of reporting, by now very familiar in cases like this. And I'd be interested to know whether this was comparable to what happened in India. I don't know enough to say. No one seemed interested, remotely interested, in any individualizing facts or features about Aneen Boyson and her personal circumstances, other than the fact that she had a foster mother whose financial resources were meager and that had forced Aneen to leave school early to get a job. Press reports simply designated her as a young woman with a foster mother, both with little education, living in a poor part of town. She stood in for many others who could have been in her position. She lacked personal definition. Her individual life trajectory was a blank. Even less was said about the men who were arrested on suspicion of the rape. And two men were arrested very early on and had a first hearing in court. They were named and they were photographed, but they had absolutely no individual outline, let alone definition. Nobody seemed remotely interested to know the details, as if most, if not all, of what needed to be known was already apparent. And I must say, this compares very, very strikingly with the recent Oscar Pistorius murder of Reeva Steenkamp, which has seen the media absolutely preoccupied with every single detail of the case. Her mother has been interviewed, her father, her uncle, her roommate, her cousin. People have been talking about her life accomplishments, her dreams, her modeling career, etc., etc., etc. It's gone on the intensely close-up, personalizing coverage of her case, very strikingly different from the other one. Instead, in Anine Boyson's case, the public analysis and diagnosis of the atrocity went in a very different sort of direction. Many experts and leaders were interviewed. They were asked, why does this sort of atrocity happen so often in South Africa? Their answers varied somewhat, but they converged in producing a litany of social pathology. The degradations of poverty, drugs and associated subcultures, patriarchal distortions of women's bodies as male property, the disintegration of the family, failures of policing, disinterest and incompetence within the state, and a milieu of impunity for violence, even atrocity. Some commentaries explicitly named the underlying implication, with reference to a trope that has become very commonplace in a post-apartheid South Africa. And I'm quoting now from one newspaper article. The agony and death of Anine Boyson, said one journalist, is the signal of a sick society, our society. The case against Anine Boyson's murderers is incomplete, and the episode is still in the public eye. There are protest marches ongoing, vigils happening over the last few days. Still, to date, the public reaction exhibits many of the same features that have characterized public outbursts against sexual violence in the past. And it's that pattern that I want now to speak about more fully, locating Anine Boyson's violation as a case within it, which will also serve to give something of a genealogy of the trope of a sick society and the kind of political and cultural work that it has come to do. And to do so, I want very, very briefly to situate the politicization of sexual violence in the post-apartheid milieu in the context of what went before, both in the recent post-apartheid past and before 1994 under apartheid. Now, I don't have to tell you, it's the same in any colonial society, that the figure of the black rapist has long been highly politicized in a country like South Africa. Indeed, it inhered in the imaginary of white society, of the idea of a white society perpetually under threat that informed the production of an apartheid racial order. And it is probably the case that this figure has a spectral presence in the genealogy of which I want to recount. But it is actually the more recent history, when sexual violence became a site of overt political debate and concern, that I want to talk about. Because in the years leading to the demise of apartheid, there was very, very little public discussion or interest in the problem of sexual violence or rape, pretty much at all. It was initially raised as a feminist issue. We had our first rape crisis center established in South Africa in 1997. But really, nobody regarded rape as a fundamental social problem. It was more something that marked the unfortunate margins of the society, despite unmistakable signs to the contrary. The first public outcry against sexual violence in South Africa took place only in 1990. It's very, very recent. A year replete with promise that the society could be otherwise. This was the year of Nelson Mandela's release. A march took place in the streets of Soweto, quote, to show the rapists that we are not happy, in the words of the organizer, a woman called Mary Mabaso. Under the auspices of the Interdenominational Women's Prayer League, with the support of the South African Council of Churches, the primary focus of the march was on the rape of the young. Placards held by the protesters said such things as, "Stop rape because you are damaging the future of young girls," "Hands off our children," and rather bizarrely, "Sexual abuse can cause abnormalities in young females." But that was it. The constitutional negotiation process began to unfold following Mandela's release, and it accommodated a recognition of the right to gender equality, freedom from harm, opening up the space for a more dynamic feminist mobilization on the issue of sexual violence. But still, there was a little bit of public interest, but no sustained traction. It was only after 1994 that things began to change, but still, the change was very modest. The abolition of apartheid censorship opened up new public spaces within which to visualize and problematize sexual violence. A new visual discourse became possible, as did recourse to the notion of human rights as a way to frame the manner of sexual violation. But these were still the heady days of South Africa's miracle, and there was little public inclination to dwell upon such horrible matters. In 1997, a research NGO issued a research report claiming that, quote, child abuse, including sexual abuse, had reached epidemic proportions. It excited no interest, no public concern. In 1998, the mood shifted a bit, excited by a prominent court case of a policeman from Khayelitsha who murdered a man who raped one of his twin daughters. When the courts handed down a sentence to him, angry crowds assembled in support of what they saw as his heroism, partly framed by their horror and disgust at what had happened to his child. A few other rape cases made headline news, excited some public discussion and debate, but overall, still, no sign of sustained public interest or concern. In 2000, a large group of men took to the streets of Cape Town, again convened by religious authorities to protest against the rampancy of sexual violence. This was a significant event. It was the first time that men had assembled in this way, acknowledging the salience of gendered power at the heart of the problem. Also in 2000, an artist named Klaas Tabeletsa won a very prestigious award for an aesthetically unremarkable but visually astounding painting of a father raping his daughter. Then, in October 2001, an absolutely unprecedented storm broke, triggering an outpouring of public horror quite unlike anything that had gone before. And it seems to me, and I'd very much like to know whether other people agree with this, that it was not dissimilar in some respects to what happened in India in December. 6 men, aged between 24 and 66, were arrested on charges of gang raping a 9-month-old baby girl in a remote and impoverished town in the Northern Cape. Details of what had happened were scant. Apparently, the child's young mother had gone off to a nearby bar, leaving the baby in the care of one of these men who was well known to her. The grandmother later found the baby with a bloodied diaper and called the police. It subsequently turned out that actually there was only one rapist, an ex-boyfriend of the young mother. But at the time when the storm broke, the incident and the imagery it evoked was of perfect, unmitigated horror. The idea of a tiny, defenseless baby gang raped by a group of men, including those entrusted with her care, and who encompassed the generational gamut from young to old, catapulted the country into nothing short of a moral panic. A new term entered our public lexicon: baby rape. Within days, journalists were busy uncovering cases of baby rape all over the country. 13 cases were documented during the month of November alone. One of the national newspapers went on to declare that, quote, child rape had rocketed to a national crisis. With baby and child rape at the epicenter of this sudden volcano of public outrage, rape more widely, including of the young and the very elderly, soon dominated the headlines too. With remarkable rapidity and intensity, the issue of sexual violence was suddenly writ large, in public conversation, in debate all over the country. Any radio, any TV talk show raised the issue. Op-ed pieces in the newspapers, letters to the editors, and editorials, all absolutely preoccupied. Baby rape, rape in general. An editorial in one of the national newspapers called it a state of emergency. There were calls for the death penalty. There were vigils, there were local, there were national marches. Parliament convened a special session to try and make sense of what had happened to baby Tsipang, as she became known. Jacob Zuma, then deputy president and head of the recently established moral regeneration movement, didn't mince his words in addressing a meeting of the movement convened in the midst of the mayhem. The society, he said, and I'm quoting him, was sick. Quoting again, there is something seriously wrong in our society, he said. Seeing in the baby rape and the wider malaise of sexual violence that it had exposed, and I'm quoting, barbarism and moral decay of the worst kind. The society had ceased to differentiate right from wrong. A sense of moral emergency of a society at risk was abundantly evident. Significantly, the horror was widely owned by men who spoke out and mobilized in new ways. I'm quoting one of them, for example. "Oh God, what is wrong with the men of this planet?" Another, "Baby rape is the most barbaric thing a man can do, with men raping their daughters and sodomizing their sons. Who can trust us?" A variety of NGOs called upon men with a new sense of urgency and demand. For example, in the words of one, "Men of Africa, do you care enough to stand up against the sexual violation of women and children?" A newly formed NGO, the South African Men's Forum, was unambiguous, and I quote, "Until you address the issue of men and the violence they perpetrate in our society, you will not begin to steer the society towards moral regeneration." Interestingly, the public outpouring included anxious impulses to revisit the past. Was all of this a new phenomenon, or had it been going on a long time, hidden and denied? One newspaper held a poll asking its readers to say, is this old or is it new? Which was a fairly interesting thing to do, presumably not on the assumption that it would produce any historically robust data, but signaling that this was an element of a national conversation about who we are and where we come from. One member of a group of women protesting against child rape, who was filmed and interviewed by the BBC, said, and I'm quoting, "Actually, it's not a new phenomenon. It's been something that you hide. You regard it as an embarrassment within the family. But now people have started to talk. They've decided that they've had enough." So the expose of a horrifying present also turned into a wider reflection, as if in a dawning realization on a sick but repressed past. If the problem was not new, it inhered at the very heart of the society, not on the margins as something easily excised. In all of these ways, then, the episode provoked an unusually public and outspoken reflection on the manner of South African nationhood. Who are we that we can do such things to our children, as one participant in one of these marches said? And for how long have we been this way? In other words, who are we? What happened, arguably, is the emergence of what Mark Seltzer has termed a pathological public sphere. Seltzer's concept adds to the many critiques of Habermas's notion of the bourgeois public sphere as a space of rational and enlightened exchange, emphasizing, as others have done, the circuits of affect and repertoires of spectacle that have characterized the production of the public sphere in modern societies. He is writing about serial killers in the United States in particular. He claims, apropos that subject matter, that, quote, the public sphere has become inseparable from the collective gathering around sites of wounding, trauma, and pathology. Sociality and the wound, he says, have become inseparable. He writes about the morbid fascination with which murders produce publics, an aggregate of individuals captivated by the details, jostling to get as close up to the crime as possible, literally and metaphorically, eagerly accumulating every detail, every vestige of the imagery of the corpse, the scene of the crime, every piece of information that attaches somehow to the event. The phenomenon, as Seltzer points out, is not new, but its formation and its dynamic has been fashioned by available technologies. So first television and now social media have made the public fascination with the pathologies of violence much more hyperbolic and intrusive in the public eye, to the extent that, he now argues, it is killing, maiming, and other modes of bodily injury that preeminently summon publics into being through gathering, discussion, exchange, and recognition. If you want an absolutely textbook case of what Mark Seltzer is talking about, then watch the televised coverage and social media trending, as reported by CNN, on the Oscar Pistorius case, or any other incident of violent crime for that matter. This morning, on Q, I heard a CNN news anchor ask viewers to return after an ad break to hear about, quote unquote, the manhunt that has captivated the entire nation. As Seltzer renders it, this pathological public sphere is an intensely individualized, atomized space. The source of the aggregation is a shared frisson, a collective morbid fascination. It doesn't issue in any activism, any mobilization. The whole is merely the sum of its parts, nothing more. Seltzer links this too to what he calls a wound culture, as one of the markers of modernity in the West from the late 19th century, albeit reconfigured in line with changes in technologies that represent and circulate images of wounding. To the extent that by now, and I'm quoting, it has become commonplace to observe that contemporary public space represents itself to itself from the art and culture scene to tabloid and TV talk as a culture of suffering, states of injury, and wounded attachments. While I don't wish any mechanical cut-and-paste application of Seltzer's thesis to the South African case, it does seem to me extremely suggestive in respect of South Africa's post-apartheid politics of sexual violence, and as much as in revealing the differences and as the similarities between the American and the South African cases. Let me very briefly explain. South Africa has a particular genealogy of the notion of a wounded society and a wounded sociality, which was centrally and fundamentally implicated in the official discourse of the transition from apartheid to democracy. The interim constitution prefaced its Bill of Rights with a version of the Constitution as a, quote, historic bridge between a damaged past and a future promise of restoration. The Constitution was represented as an instrument for healing a society wounded by its apartheid past. The trope of healing a damaged society was also uppermost in the terms and repertoires of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, created to confront that damage as an exercise in national reconciliation. Archbishop Tutu, the charismatic chair of the TRC, was explicit in situating this notion of damage at the heart of the Commission's mandate and practice. In his address to the very first gathering of the TRC, on the 16th of December 1995, he said, and I quote, "We are a wounded people. All stand in need of healing. Every South African has, to some extent or other, been traumatized." Throughout the Commission's deliberations, this notion of a shared wound, a collective trauma, was reiterated and echoed. It undergirded the Commission's guiding maxim, speaking is healing. Apartheid had produced a litany of damage. Across the board, the society had been damaged. Truth-telling became a vehicle of healing, the abiding metaphor of national reconciliation. You probably know, because you might have watched, the South African TRC was the first to hold public hearings, which were very widely televised, both nationally and internationally. The testimony of selected victims, or in the case of the deceased, family members, were televised in the case of what were called victim hearings. These were preeminently performances of damage. Viewers witnessed deep emotional distress, crying, including in the case of Archbishop Tutu, who often broke down, overcome by what he was being told and what he was witnessing. In the case of the amnesty hearings, perpetrators were interviewed and were often asked to reenact their methods of torture. So arguably, one of the effects of the televised public hearings of the TRC was to constitute a variant of a pathological public sphere. South Africans witnessing replays of wounding as the terms in which a narrative of who we were and where we had come from was being fashioned. This is, of course, a very different kind of spectacle from the hyperbolic coverage of serial killing, absolutely. The circuits of affect, the terms of public absorption and engagement were obviously different. But I think it is suggestive, nevertheless, to read the public hearings through Seltzer's lens. Through many repetitions, not least throughout the proceedings of the TRC, the idea of a collective wound inflicted in the past and carried over into the present entered what Gramsci would recognize as a post-apartheid common sense. So when baby Tsipang was raped, it seems to me unsurprising that the notion of a wounded, sick society should have leapt to the fore as a diagnosis of the depth and breadth of an underlying pathology. As would be the case in the coverage of Anine Booysen's rape and murder, in all the frantic coverage of and debate about the baby Tsipang case, there was virtually no interest in any of the personalities involved. The mother and the grandmother remained ciphers, as types, albeit with different moral valences. The young derelict mother growing up in a brutalizing township, offset by the caring, morally robust granny. The men remained a rather amorphous group, spanning the generations, standing in for all poor black men. From the outset of the public commentary, their heinous acts were situated within a landscape, once again, of social pathology, the malaise of poverty, alcoholism, dysfunctional family life. The wound which tore baby Tsipang's body apart was named. Doctors explained the reconstructive surgery that would be necessary to restore the barrier between her anus and her vagina. But this was not the locus of repeated visitations in the public eye. Rather, her bodily damage was made to speak readily and powerfully to the wound within the institutional fabric of the society, in the home and in the family. And it was associated with a series of pathological inversions. What ought to have been a space of security and safety was quintessentially menacing. Familiar men who ought to have been caring and protective were predators. Intimacy was the epitome of danger. The social locus of the wound was linked too to the manner of the national conversation as a moment of dystopic nation building. It was a time of unusual, vocal, and powerful national consensus. No one dissented from the horror of the violation. No one disputed the exposure of the wound. No one offered an alternative to the trope of a sick society. Apart, that is, from then-President Mbeki, who remained remarkably silent and distant as the panic unfolded, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Deputy President Zuma took over as the sovereign voice, speaking for the state on behalf of the nation. He deemed it sick. He called for all South Africans to rally in their recognition of a shared malady and urged a collective moral regeneration. The place of race in this interpellation is interesting. It was clear in the way that the story was told that the baby, her mother, and the alleged rapists were black. The descriptor was never directly assigned. It wasn't necessary to do so because the location of the violation was known to be a coloured township, what South Africans called a coloured township, a mixed-race township in Louisville. And lots of tacit knowledge would readily attach to that. Some of the most prominently and passionately outspoken reactions to the violation came from black people, and particularly black men. The baby rape produced what I call a scandal of manhood, particularly strongly among black men. So when one of the interlocutors in the public outcry called upon men of Africa to take a stand, it was tacitly understood, I would imagine, that he was referring mainly to black men. The woman who acknowledged to the BBC that this sort of thing had been happening for a long time and that we were in denial was a black woman. So there were strong and no doubt formative racial undercurrents in the public conversations, no doubt. It was probably this that underpinned Thabo Mbeki's distaste and his refusal to enter into the public conversation. In fact, this marked his position on rape in general. He completely dismissed the agitation about rape as hysterical, that's his word, and suggested that it simply reiterated stereotypes about the rapacious and brutalizing sexuality of black men. But if the wound had particular racial inflections, that did not unsettle the national conversation. It was, it seems to me, a moment of collective recognition and interpellation. The we remained, perhaps tenuously, a national we, confronting a South African malaise that we shared and had to own collectively. It was, as I suggest, a dystopic space of imagined community, an exercise in nation building in the name of our collective wound. Baby rape held a mirror to the fledgling new South Africa and demanded that we confront who we really were. That this was the real issue, rather than any concern about the problem of sexual violence in and of itself, was evident in the fact that in the absence of any concerned interest or sustained energy to deal with the problem as it was manifest a few months later. In December, this happened in October, in December, in fact, a 1-week-old baby was raped in KwaZulu-Natal, and there was scarcely a murmur in the public domain. I want to conclude somewhat speculatively by suggesting that the baby Tsipang case is one instance, a singularly powerful instance, perhaps, that speaks to a wider phenomenon that has become integral to the manner of politics in the recent post-apartheid milieu. You will probably know about our Mandela moment, the years 1994 to 1998, when Mandela was president, a period in which national sentiment was garnered around episodes of euphoric non-racial recognition. There were wonderful spectacles that I'm sure you probably also remember in televised coverage. The election, a profoundly euphoric occasion. Mandela's inauguration, which drew South Africans in their throngs across all sections of the population to celebrate the Rugby World Cup. More recently, unfortunately, the non-racial project has become somewhat more tenuous. The country has had to deal with a very devastating epidemic of HIV/AIDS. And as I've suggested, violence and crime have, if anything, intensified rather than receded. But this is exactly what the nation-building project has to work with. Apart from occasional repetitions of the euphoric renditions of the new South Africa, such as in the World Soccer Cup last year, South Africans, it seems to me, are most likely to recognize their common cause in their collective wounding. What does it mean to be a South African? Who are we? Is a question tacitly, if not explicitly, answered by the overwhelming national consensus that things are seriously amiss with the moral fiber of the nation. That there is a problem of violent crime is the site of the most assertive, most visible national consensus across race, class, gender, generation. Indeed, it is the most resounding consensus of the post-apartheid milieu. It produces, it seems to me, a tacit version of violence as the post-apartheid existential condition, an ineradicable fact, a pathology born of a long and deep history, a scar difficult to erase, a version, once again, of the sick society. Only in this instance, one from which a cure becomes very difficult, one for which a cure becomes very difficult to imagine. If there's any merit in my suggestion, then paradoxically, if not perversely, it's an imaginary of an ineradicably violent South Africa to which South Africa's peaceful transition has given rise. Thank you.
Well, it says on the program that I'm supposed to comment, so I will very briefly, just to raise a couple of questions and a couple of examples, and then we'll open it up to the audience. The first question which came to mind as you were talking about these special cases is the contrast between ones in which there's a media frenzy about it, such as the ones you discussed, and those in which what happens when one case comes out is a whole series of other cases come out, and it's actually a very good thing. We had a nice example this week in Ireland with the Magdalene women, where the Prime Minister of Ireland finally apologized for that. And that obviously one or two people start that and then a process gets involved. We might think of the sexual abuses in the Catholic Church, the same thing, where a few cases come out and then all of a sudden there's a lot of cases, and it actually turns into not a media crazy frenzy about something, but something quite positive. Why does one case go in one direction and the other go in the other direction? I think it's an interesting question. That took me to my second point, and to thinking about when I lived in New York City from 1972 to 1981, which, much like my time in Hartford, was at that time the most violent city in the United States statistically. And the great obsessive moment of violence in New York at that time was the Son of Sam, a serial killer, just as you're describing, that everybody probably still remembers on the front page of the newspaper all the time. And yet something that was not on the front page of the newspaper is every woman I know from that 10 years I lived in New York was the victim of a violent street crime. Every one, no exceptions. Some were raped, others were robbed at gunpoint, but every single one of them was the victim of a violent crime. Now think about what that means statistically. I mean, that's impossible, really. I mean, I knew hundreds of women in their 20s and 30s, people that I knew at Columbia University when I was a student. Every single one of them was robbed, held up, raped, threatened with rape. That's why was there so little treatment of that, right? The gender dimension of that violence. The third element that I would bring up is what has been the impact when we talk about sexual violence, specifically in rape, of the increasing publicity and apparent increasing commonality of rape as a weapon of war. Now, Stuart and I both study a lot early modern wars, and there was plenty of rape in early modern wars, but one doesn't have the sense that it was a specific, deliberate tactic, the way it has been since the end of the Second World War. And what is the impact of that on the larger perception of rape and treatment of rape in the press? And then lastly, to me, really one of the most fascinating questions, something that happened to me this fall in one of my classes, this role of social media, as you're talking about. I had a horrible incident. One of my students from the Middle West, while her parents were here for Parents' Weekend, her brother, who was a lawyer in his 20s, was shot and killed by his girlfriend, who shot him 7 times, so probably wasn't an accident. And she missed a few classes. And so I looked it up in her hometown newspaper to find out what was going on, to follow up the story a little bit. And one of the things that fascinated me was that it's an online newspaper, and so there's a comment section. You know, I'm sure you've all seen those in whatever online newspaper you're looking at. And here it is the day after the murder, and there are hundreds of comments about the story. Now, many of them are just simple expressions of sympathy. You know, they knew the guy, and oh, I feel for the family, and it's a well-known family, isn't this terrible? But others were not. One of the first comments that I read was somebody saying, oh, I can't believe drugs are involved. This girl, I knew this girl, she wasn't a user of drugs, blah, blah, blah. The next response was, what are you talking about? I was using drugs with her the night before the murder. Right? Now, this is online in the newspaper. This is not something that's in the national media, but in terms of the social media, what is happening with this sort of simple quotidian murder in a town when dozens of people who know both the victim and the perpetrator are posting things online? How do you then have a trial of that person, anything remotely like a fair trial, if anybody's been reading stories online and reading this stuff by this? This is a whole new dimension, it seems to me, to interpersonal violence in the modern world due to social media. So I'm sort of curious if that, you didn't mention any of those kinds of things, but were those kinds of things, have there been those kinds of things in India? Have those been kinds of things in the South African case? I'd be curious to know.
I don't think I can answer all your questions, but I mean, in response to your first question about it, it's a good thing, you know, that the exposure of one case leads to the exposure of others.
It can be. I'm not saying
it can be. And yes, of course, it is a good thing. And in South Africa, there has tended to be a pattern. You know, for example, with the rape of baby Tsapang, suddenly, as I said, baby rape, it literally was invented as a category, and journalists went out to find it. But one of the main points I'm making in this paper is that these episodes of anxiety, concern, anger, agitation, mobilization under the sign of sexual violence are not really, they're not really about dealing with the problem of sexual violence. That's not what's going on, I'm arguing. What's going on is that they become moments of a particular kind of national recognition, because sexual violence becomes metaphoric. It becomes metaphoric of the damage that is being done to the collective we, to the nation. And that is indeed, that is evident in the fact that, in fact, and feminists in South Africa are saying this all the time, that despite a very progressive constitution, despite the fact that women are now in all kinds of constitutional and legal ways to be protected, despite the fact that the police are supposed to create a whole infrastructure for dealing with sexual violence, in fact, there's a profound disinterest in actually grappling with the problem of sexual violence per se. Okay. I mean, you know, on the question of rape as a weapon of war, I mean, yeah, I think the scenario I'm talking about I'm specifically talking about rape in times of peace, but I do think that in general, we should be paying, we as historians, as social researchers, should be thinking about rape and sexual violence, not simply as, you know, under the rubric of gender studies. I mean, I think we should be thinking much more directly about the place of sexual violence in the production of what has become known as the modern. I mean, it seems to me that that's one of the ways of addressing this. The question of social media and all of these postings and the kind of, on the one hand, the sort of salaciousness of the exchanges, and on the other hand, the publicity of intimate details and making public things that would previously have been kept between people. That's exactly what Mark Seltzer is talking about. That's exactly the kind of pathological publicity assigned to the stuff that he's talking about. And the point that I'm making about what's different in the South African case is that in the case of the rapes that have excited these kinds of eruptions of national recognition, they are specifically not about individuals. Those individuals are made into types. That's the way in which this kind of interpolation has been produced, by not individualizing them, by blurring them, by making them indistinct, simply as exemplars and products of a particular kind of social milieu, which, as I'm suggesting, is very different from the case of Oscar Pistorius and the woman he murdered, Reeva Steenkamp. Because in that instance, South Africans by now know an incredible amount about her life, about, she was beautiful. I mean, this is reiterated again and again. There are photographs of her that circulate endlessly in this news coverage. As I say, many members of her family are interviewed, and they asked, what was she like? What kind of person? Where did she go to school? What were her dreams for the future? What were her values? What did she stand for? How do you want to remember her? A whole series of questions that were absolutely absent in the case of Anine Booysen, who was raped just a few months before Reeva Steenkamp was killed, which shows you that these two cases of violence are doing very different kinds of work in the public domain. They are constituting public discussion in very, very different kinds of ways. That's part of the argument I'm making in the paper.
Go to the audience.
Can I ask a question? That was a very disturbing paper. I'd like to, since you talked about metaphor, does Kurtz's book Disgrace have anything to say about the condition of rape in what we were talking about? It seems to be a rather...
Kurtz's book?
Disgrace. It seems to be a rather...
So you mean Coetzee?
Coetzee, yeah. It seems to be a rather a conservative reading, potentially, that, rape is something to be suffered stoically. It's a kind of our turn to suffer. It's about sort of payback, and that wounding metaphor is also part of that book. It had quite a storm in the UK. Did it have a similar effect in South Africa, or was it not relevant to what you're discussing?
Asking lots of different questions wrapped up in one. Firstly, it's not my view that rape is something to be suffered. Okay, yeah. I'm not giving my view. Yeah. I'm giving a reading of the way in which a public argument about rape has taken shape. Okay, an argument in which it has been made. It's been made to carry a particular kind of meaning. That rape has become metaphoric of what is perceived to be a particular kind of wound, a particular form of damage. Okay, and I'm not giving my wording. I mean, I'm finding this metaphor in the responses of a whole range of people, both prominent and ordinary, to it. Okay, so I just want to clarify that it's absolutely not my view at all that rape is something that should be suffered. Exactly the opposite. I share the frustration. I'm a feminist, and I share the frustration of many people whose response to what happens in South Africa is how many more rapes need to be publicized in order to actually animate organization and response to that, to deal with the problem of sexual violence itself. But what happens instead is the agitation, the outcry is having a different kind of effect. Okay. On the question of the book, Disgrace, I mean, there were many reactions to it. I mean, it's a book that is, it's actually a textbook. It's a prescribed book in many South African schools, and there are many different readings of it. So I don't think there's one. I don't think that and I don't think that it's had a huge effect on public debate. I mean, it's something that's debated probably in more literary and intellectual circles.
Actually,
you were talking about how this, the issue of the rape has been dealt with as, the wounding of the entire society and a malaise of the entire society. Looking at, the responses of all kinds of, prominent people in India to the rape that happened in December, and I've been away, so I've only been following it on, very limited media. But looking at that kind of a response, idiotic religious leaders and political leaders making, horrendous comments, as those of, some people who are in India would have followed it to a much greater degree. It seemed to be, that the problem either lies with the women or it's a problem for women. I tend to almost think that it would be more positive if it was recognized as a problem for the entire society, that men are also wounded by the fact that there is rape. I think it's positive rather than thinking it of as just a violence against women. It is a violence against the entire society.
You want to add to that? Yeah.
See, I think that's a very, I was just thinking of that, and the South African and the Indian parallel. Men, and the question of the wounded society, men of my generation who are committing rapes in India do not have the sense of a wounded society.
Exactly. That is,
so where do we go back to in understanding these events? And that's been my process. We are going back to issues of feudalism, urban, rural, masculinity, power, but these are all diffused. It seems for South Africa, there is a more focused trope to go back to. That is the notion of, but either way, it doesn't help. Either way, it covers the real facts, probably. We are in the diffused or the less diffused is not helping or providing any clarification or even a solution to the problem.
Exactly, so. Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that what was very powerful symbolically about the case that really framed, I mean, remember the picture I've painted is of a society in which there are very high orders of rape and sexual violence, but in which there's virtually no sustained public reaction before 2001, before the rape of baby Tsipang. That is really the catalyst. That is really the trigger. That names the issue, frames the issue. And it seems to me enormously significant that it was the rape of a baby. Okay. Because, there is absolutely no way that you can locate any responsibility, any blame, anything in the case of a baby for what happened. Unlike the case, I mean, if it was an adult woman, then there's always the possibility of some or other more complicated reading of what happened. Maybe she asked for it, maybe women are, whatever. But if it's a baby, then the moral burden of that has to be carried by the man. It absolutely has to be. And it seems to me that was the unbelievable shock and power of what happened. And it was completely unexpected. It was this sudden kind of, oh my God, how do we make sense of this? And then this kind of sudden flurry of saying, well, but it wasn't only this baby. It's happening to babies all over the place. And this kind of ferreting out of all these baby rapes in a country where that hadn't even been named. We didn't know that there was such a thing. And then as the conversation progresses, it's not even lots of babies being raped now. It's, in the past, it was also the case that babies were being raped. So the problem, the nature of the problem of rape was constituted in such a way that there was no way around the fact that men were at the heart, at the root of it. Yeah. So that seems to me a very powerful difference. But I agree with you that in both cases, what is happening is the problem is being named and the problem is being owned, but not as a problem of sexual violence per se. It's a problem of nationhood. Yeah.
The time gap between the rape in India, in Delhi, and the disclosure of her name and her identity, personal history, that was an interesting period because there was not such a scrabbling as far as I was also away in Kolkata, but not such a great deal of scrabbling for the details of her personal history. But something very interesting happened. Groups gave her names. you know, and one of the very beautiful names was Lightning, Damini. And in a way, that inattention to the person and what she wanted out of life and so on and so forth, or even not much talk about the identity of the rapists. It so turned out later that they both came from, all of them came from pretty similar caste class backgrounds, and except for one of the rapists. So that, I think, you know, the in a sense,
but there was a lot of information about the rapists. That was the
there was, but not such a great deal made out of that. You know, being interviewed.
in the media. You actually about the slums, and there was a whole discourse.
Yeah, there was a discourse, but you know, not nothing. They came from slums. Now the girl also came from not a slum, but an upwardly mobile thing.
Very beginning.
Huh.
People were already beginning to talk.
So let me just finish. Let me just finish. But I thought that, you know, had it been the United States, there would have been, it would have been a much more detailed kind of investigation into that. But whether she would survive or not, that really held attention for a very, very long time. What I wanted to ask, but you know, it was a Delhi experience, because in Calcutta, before that, in West Bengal, with a new woman chief minister, there had been reports of rapes. And every time something got reported, the chief minister would say, this is a slander against my, my kind of, my rule. There were no demonstrations, big demonstrations against the rapes in Calcutta as such. But when the Delhi rape happened, it kind of galvanized demonstrations, protests, and talk about the rapes that had been going on, even publicized all over the country, including Calcutta, though, you know, it came later. So that was something quite interesting, and it seems very interesting that, in a sense, that's been happening on a global scale, that the Delhi rape, the Delhi protests have been so widely reported and had kind of effects beyond the specific rape case. But my question to you is specifically, I can see what you mean by that, but is it possible to completely separate this kind of self-reflection and anxiety about what kind of people we are from the question of what prodded it? You know, can one say that there is no anxiety about sexual violence? What you make very clear is it's not sexual violence per se, but it's the fact that it happens to a baby. And a baby without any kind of, you know, she asked for it, possibility attached to that. But is it possible that this kind of worry that is being expressed in the public domain has nothing to do with...
I just want to get my pen. I've just dropped it. I'm listening to you.
Yes, no, I finished.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you with the, I'm sorry, with the red scarf? Or you were...
Scarf. David Goldfrank.
What?
David wants to speak. David Goldfrank.
I listen to him all the time. You know, he has the
But yes, there was a lot of that, you know.
All day long. I don't hear the people at the...
Baying for blood was there in the Indian case too. Huh.
Could I say something? One is the specific case of the rape, but I think before I come to that, in terms of the parallel that you are drawing, I think there is a parallel. Your discussion of the pathological, I'm not sure whether one can think in terms of the pathological public sphere everywhere, but and whether it is just one spectacle which brings the country together, whether that itself is also true for all places.
I'm not suggesting that it is.
Yeah, but in India, this rape also comes at a time, and the reactions against it, which has been really dramatic and very powerful, the reactions come also at a time for which where the public sphere, even if it is in Delhi, that the civil sphere has reacted on a variety of other issues. And there has been a certain sense of the breakdown of the state, complete breakdown of the bureaucracy, complete breakdown, a certain breakdown of the morality of the people. The issue of corruption, for instance, became one of the biggest things where thousands and thousands and thousands, and not even thousands, lakhs and lakhs of people came together in seemingly spontaneous, but very often organized by various social groups. All political groups had to deal with them. And the demand from the parliament, they have been able to actually force the parliament to introduce measures about corruption, whatever that nature. Now, there have been waves and waves of movements on this. So what I'm saying is that there is a certain activity within the public sphere, which seems similar to this, but we need to define the difference. There has been a certain sense of sickness of society, which again, a moral outrage against what is going on within society. No, and the rape comes at a point where this moral outrage has been expressed in a variety. And in a certain sense, in the earlier outrages which happened over corruption, it's not a question of us and them. It's those people who are actually coming out onto the street to protest were people who themselves are corrupt. They are complicit in the activity of corruption. They are traders, merchants. It's not just the middle class. There is also why it is important to reflect on that is there is, I think, a negotiation with the self there. There is a certain sense of guilt and complicity in the production of the society, in the production of the morals of the society. And one of the ways in which you do it is by protesting against it and coming out onto the street, raising slogans. So there is, in protesting, it is not always against somebody else. It is also protesting where you want to negotiate what you really feel and how you want. So in this particular case, the parallel, there is another parallel which is there, which is actually the gory description. It's not a baby, but the fact that she was mutilated in the most horrific way, that actually caught the imagination of the people. And while it is true that some people said that women are responsible, but that's not the only. That even Tutu there is saying that it's a stereotyping. So those kind of voices are there, but there is actually a public outrage which has to be understood in relation to a wider, longer-term outrage against various things in society.
Well, can I respond individually? Otherwise, I'm going to forget. And link.
We have 4 minutes left. So
okay.
Just giving you, so you might as well start with your response right now.
Well, I don't know. Then let me just collect all the questions then I'll respond in there.
Anil.
Yeah.
The lack of focus or the absence of focus on the identity of the details about the woman in this particular case actually fed very nicely into...
Are you talking about the Indian case?
Yeah, the Indian case, yeah. That it was actually a call that came from the political leaders. Let's not violate the privacy of the family. And so preserving the sanctity of the family. And also, in a way, it was showing it was an attempt, at least in my understanding, a way to show that the nation and the state is still very much intact, respectful of the family. So that was my reading of the silence around the details of the family. It was not that it is there's some kind of a difference between Indian society and not.
And if I could just add to that one line, and I think related to that, there was also a kind of an unprecedented discussion, particularly in the social networking sites, about relating to this whole question of failed state, that how each citizen will have to arrogate the role of the state to himself. And there was an unprecedented discussion about the possible punitive measures which can be taken. And this is something which I think distinguishes this particular case from the previous cases, because there's a huge punitive energy which was like in absolute circulation. So it's a little more complicated.
Mirrored the violence of the
Okay,
rape.
so what you're
So
saying...
the call for the death penalty and that each one of us has to act as a state when the real state has failed.
But the punitive is not about finding out why it happened. It is how to deal with it. But the why it happened still remains a black hole.
Circuit, the due processes of
It is a
law
black hole.
and so on.
There is, the discourse has moved to how to punish and how to have legislations and police. The logic of corruption is about how to punish. But the discourse of why it happens is still a black hole.
But I think you all know much more about the Indian example than I do, but it seems to me that what you're confirming, or what the discussion is confirming, is, first of all, that, and I don't mean to suggest at all that pathological public sphere is this concept that you can sort of take and place here and there and whatever. I mean, I'm looking in particular at how a concept that, as I said, Celsa was developing for America and for, historically in America over a period of time, just resonated in a very powerful way for me in a completely different history, and overdetermined by, a very, very different kind of politics and political project. But I think what this confirms is that, all of these things are going to have histories that are very particular, but that in the midst of that history, the question of sexual violence has a particularly powerful valency to speak beyond itself, to be made meaningful, and to be made meaningful in ways that capture, contextually, conjuncturally, a variety of facets about the wider society, its regime of power, its manner of the national subject. And I think it comes back to me, it reverts for me to the discussion we were having before about what violence is. And I mean, I think we've gotten to the point now where we don't want to say that violence is defined specifically by bodily harm. I mean, violence is probably about damage in some more generic sense, but certainly a species of violence is about the damage that happens to the body. And so the literal body is a very powerful metaphor for the social body, and the sexually violated body, it seems to me, is even more potent, more metaphorically potent in the way in which these public conversations develop, in the ways in which meanings of violence are configured. And that much more powerful and unambiguous if the sexually violated body is a baby or a young child. So it seems to me it confirms, I mean, even though the debate in India is picking up, if the metaphorical stickiness, if you like, of the rape in India must be different because the politics is different, the conjuncture is different, and it's picking up on these, all of these different kinds of things. And I've just forgotten my strand of thought. So, yeah.
Well, we have plenty left to discuss at dinner. I think that's fair to say. And to be reasonable to the people who are about to come in this room and set up our dinner, I suggest that we stop here and thank our speaker of the evening.